Modern public administration rests on a basic assumption: the rational actor. This model assumes that political action is driven by a mix of legacy building, personal ambition, and self-interest. But when you tie a massive organizational apparatus to the ego and identity of a single leader, you create a central hub. Every decision, every critique, and every risk must filter through one human mind. What happens to a nation's infrastructure when that single, ego-driven actor hits maximum psychological capacity? Traditional statecraft builds robust external systems, checks, balances, and bureaucratic layers, yet it ignores the internal mechanics of the person operating those systems. Relying on intellect and secular ambition to sustain a leader creates a system with a fixed limit of endurance. When every point of tension must be resolved by a single ego, the entire structure is designed to fail under pressure. A recent philosophical dialogue emerging from Myanmar frames public service through a different lens, challenging the rational actor model. The framework relies on anatta, the concept of non-self. This serves as a structural technology for leadership. The standard approach requires a leader to act as the owner of public projects. The anatta model proposes an organizational structure devoid of a central ego. This side-by-side shows how a traditional node hoards credit for success. In doing so, it also absorbs the anxiety of potential failure. This creates a psychological and logistical bottleneck where data and resources pile up, waiting for approval. Operating from a state of anatta removes that friction. When a leader removes their personal identity from the equation, resources flow instantly, increasing the scalability of public service. Removing the doer from the work maximizes the output. The system remains resilient because there is no central self to absorb and store the stress of the operation. To understand why, we have to look at atta, or ego. In politics, this manifests as the mindset that I am doing this, or this is my project. Acting with atta forces the leader into a closed psychological loop. Their personal worth is inextricably tied to the project's visible success. Secular political movements leverage this collective identity attachment to rally supporters. The movement becomes synonymous with the personality of the leader. But owning a project carries a heavy operational cost. If you claim the credit, you must also harbor the risk. That attachment generates a constant fear of loss. The friction generated by managing this public self consumes bandwidth. It limits the actual physical infrastructure a leader can execute. The historical archetype for solving this bottleneck is Siddhartha Gautama. Framing him outside of deity worship reveals an empirical case study in radical decoupling. This ancient structure marks where he recognized that structural suffering could not be solved while operating inside the identity constraints of a monarch. Shedding his kingdom, property, and titles was a strategic prerequisite, a necessary step to bypass the limitations of his assigned role. Abandoning the ego identity allowed him to align his actions with universal operational laws rather than the narrow political laws of a single state. Systemic intervention often requires the leader to step entirely outside the system's identity constraints. The source text applies this theory to a modern setting, a Sayadaw who divested from all personal enterprise and property to focus strictly on parahita, or public service. The standard rational assumption predicts that abandoning personal wealth and ownership would immediately end his productive output. The actual outcome was different. Stripping away ownership triggered a rapid scaling of infrastructure, yielding meditation centers and large-scale public funds. The model faced a critical test during the pandemic, enabling the organization to deploy emergency COVID-19 hospitals, like this one, when traditional systems stalled. The mechanical reason for this success is straightforward. Because there is no central owner experiencing a fear of failure, the friction of complex decision-making drops to zero. When a leader has nothing to lose personally, the organization operates at its maximum theoretical efficiency. The source text uses a physical metaphor to explain this organizational stress: an air-conditioned room. An ego-driven system functions like a sealed, closed thermodynamic box that traps the leader inside. This closed system requires constant artificial energy just to maintain its internal stability. Inside, the noise and stress bounce endlessly off the walls, amplifying with every cycle. The anatta system behaves like opening the doors to the vast atmosphere. The trapped pressure flows outward, dissipating seamlessly into the open air. Ego is a closed thermodynamic system, doomed to overheat. Egolessness is an open system, capable of infinite heat dissipation. This explains a direct critique found in the text regarding highly educated political actors navigating national crises. Educational pedigree and worldly skills provide technical capability, but they lack an internal framework for managing ego attachment. When these purely intellectual actors face sustained crises, the internal pressure has nowhere to go. The structure remains rigid until it reaches its breaking point. Without an underlying operational mechanic of non-attachment, technical capability eventually cracks under the weight of its own ego. True nation-building requires integrating the technical capability of the intellect with the psychological resilience of Dhamma, the universal law of non-attachment. This integrated framework does not function by fighting pressure. This diagram shows how the system absorbs and passes the force through seamlessly, leaving the structure intact. Letting go of the self expands a leader's capacity to serve. It removes the internal resistance that usually impedes large-scale action. Operationally, the most effective way to sustain a leader's output is to remove the leader's ego from the work.